All right, so during the 1979-1980 Phase 3 excavation of the Catoctin Furnace African American Cemetery, Sharon Ann Burnston served as the field supervisor under the direction of Ron Thomas as the principal investigator. Her memories of the data recovery field sessions and her subsequent publications reflect her understanding of the enslaved persons as invisible people, a truth that reflected the prevailing narrative of the time. Reanalysis of the cemetery remains has validated the rigor that was brought to the investigation, and her memories are an essential aspect of the archaeological history of the site. As a young female archaeologist in a male-dominated profession, Sharon arrived at the site with qualifications based on her previous cemetery work in Philadelphia. Next slide. As the Catoctin excavation proceeded, Sharon sensed the invisibility of the enslaved individuals within the historical documentary record, as well as within the bureaucracy of the Maryland State Highway Administration. Soon after completing this excavation, Ms. Bernstein left the field of archaeology and pursued a decades-long career as a leading expert on late 18th century American clothing and as a museum curator. In the later half of her life, she produced countless historically accurate replica garments and patterns, schooled a generation of clothing historians and historical reenactors, and even advised Hollywood. The book she published on the subject, Fitting and Proper, is regarded as a seminal work in the field. Sharon died in November 2022, and this paper is dedicated to her and the work she undertook at the African American Cemetery at Catoctin Furnace. Next slide. Excavations at the cemetery site were conducted in 1979 and 1980 by Mid-Atlantic Archaeological Research of Newark, Delaware, contracted to and funded by the Maryland State Highway Administration. Ron Thomas hired Sharon as the field director for the project. Ron, as the principal investigator, was overseeing several other projects and left Sharon in charge of the day-to-day operations, including all decision-making. The former owner of the land, Mr. William Renner, told Sharon that the cemetery contained, quote, blacks and Indians, unquote, that it had passed out of regular use before the end of the 19th century, and that he himself had accidentally disturbed a human grave in the area some 40 years prior to the excavation. Before the excavation took place, the only visible surface features were a dozen or so rough field stones erected to stand as grave markers. They bore no apparent inscriptions and were of local quartzite, unretouched, except that a few had a small ledge or flat space apparently chipped off at one end. Next slide. The cemetery lay within a half-mile of the furnace between an old limestone quarry pit and a gravel washing pond. Next. A total of 35 graves were excavated, an estimated 1/3 of the total graves within the cemetery. This is one of the local fieldstone grave markers, a close-up of it. Historical documentary research, oral history, and intensive artifact analysis provided an informative basis for the field investigations. Sharon immediately realized that the individuals interred in the cemetery were of African ancestry, probably connected with the operations of the Catoctin Iron Furnace complex during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Next. Sharon felt a personal connection with the individuals within the cemetery, and she shared her feelings and dreams about them with her crew of archaeologists. The morning after the excavation of a mother and child buried together, she recounted a dream about them in which she felt they were communicating with her, either on a subconscious or supernatural level. At any rate, Sharon felt that she needed to tell their story, assuring that they were no longer invisible. Sharon recounted cradling crania in a box on her lap as the remains were taken by car to the temporary laboratory and storage facility in nearby Thurmont. Realizing the African ancestry of the individuals based on their crania, Sharon contacted Dr. Lawrence Angel, then a physical anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, and transferred the remains to his laboratory for osteological analysis. The collection was ultimately turned over to the Smithsonian, mainly to avoid state curation fees, as this letter suggests. And the letter that's up on the screen right now, not to throw anyone under the bus, but this is the Maryland State Highway Administration basically saying, yes, we want to transfer ownership or stewardship of the remains to the Smithsonian, because otherwise we don't, quite know what to do with them. And it is, frankly, well, I guess the phrase would be, from my point of view, a blessing in disguise, because the Smithsonian actually did have the facilities and the protocols to care for these remains. Next slide, please. The careful excavation, oh yeah, that's a close-up of what they said, they didn't want to be responsible for the 37 boxes. Next slide. The careful examination under Sharon's supervision has greatly facilitated subsequent research, some of which was presented at the conference, and we will be presenting more in months to come here. Sharon carefully collected soil from both the crania and thoracic areas of the burials. While the possibility of aDNA research was not in Sharon's analysis toolkit, because the Human Genome Project wasn't launched until 1990, more than 10 years after the Catoctin excavation, and completed 13 years later in 2003. So it wasn't on anybody's radar screen in 1979, 1980. But Sharon's careful handling of the individuals at Catoctin enabled the recent identification of families and the possibility of connections to a contemporary descendant community. And the slide that you're looking at now, in addition to showing the excavation in the corner, shows the 5 families that aDNA has been able to identify within the cemetery, again, because of the careful excavation that Sharon supervised and that her crew undertook. Sharon researched available documents in Catoctin Furnace, in Thurmont, Frederick, and Annapolis, but failed to identify any reference to the cemetery. And to this day, other than the Moravian diaries, there is no reference to in historical documentation for the cemetery. It was really lost to history. The land was owned by the operators of the Catoctin Furnace in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, all of whom owned enslaved persons. And that's from the Johnsons through and including Willoughby Maybury, the Brins, the Kunkles, the Blackfords, Thornbury. Everybody that owned Catoctin Furnace owned some enslaved persons, either at the furnace or in their mansion or their plantation, or in all 3. The use of enslaved labor for skilled work was, of course, a common practice at other contemporaneous ironworks in the region. So Catoctin was unfortunately not an unusual situation. The disposition of enslaved persons in the 1811 will of one of the owners of Catoctin Furnace suggested to Sharon that his enslaved persons were a community of family groups, and that he was attempting to preserve the nuclear family units in his division of slaves among his heirs. Her correct supposition has been demonstrated by contemporary aDNA research that has identified the 5 families within the cemetery population. Next slide. Since historic documentation regarding the cemetery and its occupants was not forthcoming, Sharon relied on inference drawn from the observation of the relatively scant archaeological data. The site produced a limited range of artifactual materials, some prehistoric lithic flakes in the topsoil and grave fill, some surface finds of a domestic and or agricultural nature, the skeletons themselves, coffin nails, coffin wood fragments, buttons, and pins, including shroud pins. All excavated individuals were buried in coffins, generally of the pinch toe type, and constructed with simple slats. Of the artifacts found in association with the skeletons, the only class of object that provided Sharon any criteria for dating were the coffin nails, two of which are shown here. Based on the changes in nail manufacturer technology, hand-wrought, machine-cut with hand-wrought heads, and totally machine-made nails, Sharon dated the site to plus or minus 1790 to 1840. Specifically, features 34 and 35 were two individuals now identified as a mother and her infant son buried in a common grave in separate coffins. Based on the dating criteria employed, the infant's burial was dated to 1820 plus or minus, while the mother's burial was dated at least 20 years earlier. Sharon concluded rightfully that old nails were still in use or were being reused in this context decades after they were no longer in manufacture, and that in fact the two burials date to the same period. So the nails were not conclusive, not helpful, I should say, in this dating technique, not surprisingly. She noted the unsatisfactory nature of nail technology criteria as a dating device, but employed them solely because no better criteria were available. Next slide, please. The only other coffin hardware items found were flat strips of ferrous metal, apparently used as reinforcing brackets in the construction of one coffin. The coffins were of simple slat construction, and samples of coffin wood from two burials, numbers 10 and number 6, have been identified as chestnut and white oak, respectively. The grave goods consisted of 22 buttons, suggesting that at least 4 individuals were buried in some type of clothing, and the remains of 27 straight pins, suggesting that at least 10 other individuals were buried in shrouds. There was no evidence of jewelry or any other clothing or footwear or of hardware such as buckles or cobbler's nails. Of the buttons that were found, 11 were brass and 2 were white metals in varying sizes, all plain flat ring with a ring eye back, such as the one shown. 7 were bone, 5 hold, and 2 were shell, 4 hold. These buttons were of little use in refining the date ranges of their respective burials, since they have a functional date range from the early 18th to the mid 19th century. So buttons, of course, you know, I know when I was growing up, one never threw away a piece of clothing without first cutting all the buttons off. So buttons are something that are reused and reused and reused again. So as a dating device, they're very problematic, although they tell you a great deal about the individual that might have been wearing or buried in the clothing. The shroud pins were of cuprous metal, probably brass, and fiber samples found in conjunction with one of the buttons and in conjunction with one of the pins, next slide please, were both identified as woven textile remains and were presumed to be clothing and shroud fragments respectively. Subjected to a spectrometer analysis, both were identified as wool. So we don't know if that means that these burials took place in the winter, but wool was worn year-round historically. Sharon's interest in clothing is apparent in her 1981 analysis, in which she noted that only 4 individuals showed evidence of having been buried in clothing, while 10, mostly infants, showed evidence of burial in shrouds. The only cases where textile fibers were preserved was in immediate proximity to metal artifacts, buttons and pins, Next slide, please. Any clothing or other textile material not so associated decomposed without leaving a recognizable trace. Sharon noted that clothing, particularly for women, might have been worn as outfits with no hardware or other durable material whatsoever, such as garments tied with drawstrings or cloth ties, or perhaps some sort of sewn footwear, if there was any footwear at all. A young man might have worn a garment with cloth, thread, or wooden buttons and stockings or homemade shoes if he wasn't buried barefoot. Sharon wrote that, like their clothing, the beliefs, values, and aspirations of the people buried at the Catoctin Cemetery also seem to have vanished without a trace. From the field work, it is possible to identify certain aspects of the material culture surrounding their internment: graves marked with rough field stones, simple coffins, construction with wrought or cut nails, interments in simple clothing or in shrouds. It is also possible to discern what may be termed a Christian pattern of burial: coffin burial, extended supine position with hands folded over the midsection, orientation with heads generally to the west, and perhaps some indication of family groupings within the cemetery. Now, again, I'm speaking in Sharon's voice here 40 plus years ago, rather than what we, of course, now know today using the ADNA, which has clearly identified 5 families. Sharon opined that the sorts of distinctive burial practices generally associated with African heritage in Black American cemeteries were absent at Catoctin. There were no graveyard decorations, no heaps of broken crockery, bottles, seashells, in particular white seashells, ornamental vases, or architectural fragments reported for Black cemeteries in 19th century South Carolina and elsewhere, nor were there the carved grave markers reminiscent of African carved figures, as have been seen, for example, in Sunbury, Georgia by Blassingame. There were also no necklaces, beads, bracelets, finger rings, knives, tobacco pipes, etc., such as were found in a late 18th century slave cemetery in Barbados by Handler and Lang. The only evidence of funeral offerings was botanical. One infant grave had a corona of seed clusters surrounding the crania area. Sharon thought this could be a floral wreath surrounding the head, but later identified the seeds as blackberry or raspberry seeds, which Sharon postulated raised the intriguing image of a crown of thorns. 2 other graves contained a concentration of seeds lying on top of the coffin surface, which were identified as sassafras. And I'm showing you here what sassafras foliage looks like. The sassafras fruit and fall foliage are apparently highly ornamental, as you can see from this slide, having dark blue berries in bright red cups pendant on red stems. As sassafras and berries are not plants generally associated with funeral floral arrangements, their significance is not clear. The appearance of fruit and seed funeral wreaths as opposed to flowers was unusual and may represent African American folk supernatural beliefs. Sharon thought it was significant that they appeared to have been so thoroughly Christianized in their burial practices. Religion was often imposed by a Christian master upon his or her enslaved, and he or she had full authority as to how they would be buried. Preferences in this matter might range from full Christian rites with no folk customs, through some tolerance of folk practice as an insistence on a purely functional and efficient internment with a complete prohibition of any observance whatsoever. Next slide, please. Sharon did not believe it was necessary to assume that the people buried at Catoctin were Christianized, but merely recognized that they lived within a system of extensive control. The possible botanical offerings may have been the only means of funeral-associated personal expression permitted them. While historical archaeology has been called the record of the people who had no share in the written record, in this case, our best efforts archaeologically have told us next to nothing about the people themselves, about what mattered to them, their beliefs, values, and aspirations. In many ways, Sharon believed the people buried at the Catoctin Cemetery remained as invisible in the archaeological record as they were in the historical record, as invisible to us in some ways as they were to society in their own lifetimes. However, Sharon Ann Burnston's meticulous excavation and recordation techniques have ensured that neither she nor the enslaved individuals she carefully investigated remain invisible. When I told Sharon that the team had chosen the mother, burial 35, and the young man, burial 15, to be the subjects of facial reconstruction, she was astonished. Next slide, please. She stated that these two individuals were the ones that she remembered most clearly and that she would have chosen. Sharon's legacy is constantly present in the reanalysis of the cemetery remains and resultant research shared with you today. Next slide. Her human-centered approach is evident in subsequent interpretations. The research reported today and within the entire project has validated the rigor that she brought to the investigation, and her memories are an essential aspect of the archaeological history of the site. Thank you.